The carriage had barely stopped rolling when Mrs. Vane appeared at the top of the steps with a letter in her hand. She held it the way a constable holds a warrant, angled toward the assembled household so that every footman and under-housemaid standing in the cold could see the paper. The seal already broken. The black ink of official correspondence unmistakable even at a distance. Cecily, Duchess of Ravenmore, stood 2 steps below her, in a dark gray gown pressed for the occasion, and not quite warm enough for late November. And she watched the carriage door open with the expression she had spent 27 years learning to wear, composed, faintly occupied, as though her attention were required elsewhere, and she had graciously interrupted it for this. The man who descended was Edward Ashwell, Viscount Dunmore, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark blue coat fitted without flourish to a frame that had nothing soft about it. He was 34, and looked it in the way that men look their age when they have been precise rather than careless. The jaw like chiseled limestone, eyes the gray-green of a winter sea. No expression that she could name on his face, except a quality of attention that made the steps, the household, and finally Cecily herself feel as though they had been catalogued. He did not look at the letter in Mrs. Vane's hand. He looked at Cecily's hands instead. Her left rested at her side. Her right, she realized, was pressed flat against the seam of her gown. "Your Grace," he said. The words were level, not warm, and she was not sure whether the slight pause between them and his next breath meant anything at all. "My lord," she said. Mrs. Vane stepped forward. "I have taken the liberty of reviewing the correspondence that arrived this morning on the matter of the Hartley tenancy, Your Grace. I thought Lord Dunmore would wish to see it directly, as it bears on the accounts." "Thank you, Mrs. Vane," Cecily said, because she had learned, in the 18 months since the old Duke's death, that thank you was the only response that surrendered nothing. Dunmore's eyes moved from Cecily to Mrs. Vane, not to the letter, to the woman holding it. The housekeeper smiled, the smile of a woman accustomed to being useful, and something in Cecily's chest pulled at the sight of it the way a stitch pulls when a wound is older than it should be. She said nothing. She led them both inside, and the door of Ravenmore House closed behind them all with a sound like a sentence already written. She did not yet know what it said. Cecily had been born the second daughter of a clergyman in a village 9 miles from Harrogate, and the year she turned 9, her father had died of a fever. He had not troubled himself to mention until it was too late, and everything that might have followed, the schooling, the sisters at a proper dame's school with copybooks and primers, and patient women who pointed to letters, had not followed. Her aunt had kept her instead, a woman who regarded female learning as an affectation and female intelligence as a liability. And what Cecily had been given was a talent for memory, a good ear, and the particular quick intelligence of a person who must navigate every room without the tool that everyone else carries without noticing. She had married the Duke of Ravenmore at 19. He was a kind man, 58 years old, who had needed a wife for the sake of appearances, and who had been, in his quiet way, genuinely fond of her. He managed every letter that crossed the threshold of Ravenmore House himself, signed every document with his own hand, and it had not been difficult for Cecily to arrange her world so that the lack was never visible. She memorized. She delegated. She cultivated the air of a woman who considered administrative detail beneath her attention, and the household had accepted this in the way households accept the small peculiarities of duchesses, which is to say without question and with some small private satisfaction. Then the old Duke had died, on a Tuesday in April, and 3 months later she had asked Mrs. Vane to confirm what a solicitor's letter said. She had asked because the letter was sealed with the solicitor's mark, and the words at the top were longer than usual, and she had wanted to be certain before she signed. She had framed it carefully. She had said, "I wonder whether Mr. Hargreaves' office has sent the correct copy. Would you cast your eye over it? I have mislaid my reading glasses." She had not owned reading glasses in her life. She had spoken with the confidence of a duchess, nevertheless, and Mrs. Vane had looked at the letter, and then at Cecily. And something had moved behind the housekeeper's eyes that had nothing to do with confirmation. A woman of 46 who has spent 22 years in service and has watched fortunes pass through a house without a shilling, resting in her own hand, knows an opportunity when it stands before her, waiting to be named. "The tenancy transfer, Your Grace," Mrs. Vane had said. "Straightforward. I shall have it ready for your signature this afternoon." Cecily had said thank you. She had not signed it that afternoon. She had understood, even so, in the way that a person understands the weight of weather before the rain arrives, that she had shown Mrs. Vane something she could not unshow, and that the woman would decide what to do with it in her own time, and entirely at her own convenience. She had been correct on both counts. Thomas, who was 19 and conscientious, and had a habit of being in passages when things were said that were not meant to carry, heard Mrs. Vane speak of it once to the under-housemaid in the linen room, 8 days after the solicitor's letter. He repeated it to Cecily a fortnight later, haltingly, not certain whether he ought. Mrs. Vane had said plainly that the Duchess could not manage her own affairs, that someone would have to do it for her, and that she herself was prepared to bear that responsibility as the household required. She had said it the way one says a fact about the weather, without malice, without shame, as though it were simply a condition of the landscape. Thomas had looked at the floor when he told Cecily this. Cecily had said thank you, and told him to say nothing further. And he had nodded and gone. Lord Dunmore came to Ravenmore twice each year by the terms of the trust established at the old Duke's death, once in spring for the tenancy records, and once in late autumn for the full accounts review. Cecily had met him 3 times before his arrival that November morning, always in the company of solicitors, always across a desk or a dining table laid for 12. He was not a man who required warmth in a room in order to function, and she had not offered him any. The old Duke had spoken of him rarely, always with a quality of careful respect that stopped just short of affection, and Cecily had concluded that the two men had understood each other in the way that formal men of duty understand each other, which is deeply but without display. What she had not known, because she could not read his letters, was that Dunmore had written to her 3 times in the past 4 months. Once in August, to inquire about the spring tenancy figures, which had not matched the rents collected. Once in September, to flag a discrepancy in the household accounts that the trust's own records did not explain. Once in October, with a more direct question about a payment of £42 made to a firm she would not recognize, as the firm did not exist. She had not answered because she had not known the letters had arrived. Mrs. Vane had told her twice that nothing of consequence had come from the trust. Cecily had no way to verify this. He knew she had not answered. She could see that he knew in the way he moved through the house the first morning, quiet and thorough, examining the ledgers laid out in the study, pausing at columns that did not add to what they should. He asked her nothing that day. He asked Mrs. Vane a great deal, in a voice whose temperature did not change. And Mrs. Vane answered everything with the confident fluency of a woman who has had months to prepare her answers, and Cecily stood near the window and looked at the park and felt the cold coming through the glass. The second morning he came to her. She was in the morning room, where she sat each day to receive the household's daily report, which Jenny read to her from the management book under the pretense of keeping records. He knocked, which no one else at Ravenmore had yet done, and she said, "Come in." And he entered, and did not sit until she indicated the chair across from her. And when he sat, he placed a single sheet of paper on the desk between them without preamble. "This is the listing of payments made from the household account between January and October of this year," he said. "I would ask your grace to indicate any payments that you do not recognize." The paper lay on the desk. She looked at it. He looked at her. She had survived worse moments than this by remaining still. She was very good at remaining still. "I would need to consult Mrs. Vane," she said. "She manages the day-to-day." "I have consulted Mrs. Vane," he said. "She provided this list." "Then I am sure it is correct." "I am not sure that it is," he said, his voice level. No edge to it, nothing in it that she could call hostile. "3 payments in this column reference a supplier who does not appear in any prior year's accounts. When I asked for the corresponding invoices, Mrs. Vane indicated they had been filed separately, and she would locate them. That was yesterday morning." Cecily said nothing. Dunmore did not press. He looked at the paper for a moment, then picked it up and folded it and put it inside his coat. "I will ask again this afternoon," he said, and stood. He was at the door when he stopped. "You have not touched the household account ledger since your husband died," he said. He did not make it a question. "The ledger is Mrs. Vane's province," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am aware of that." He left. Cecily pressed her hands flat on the desk and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed, carefully, the way she had learned to breathe when the tide of her own secret rose higher than she could stand. If you are still with her in this room, with your hands pressed flat on the wood like she is, then you understand already what she is carrying. Stay. She is not finished. The kitchen passage was narrow and cold at 5 in the morning, lit by a single candle she carried herself. Cecily had learned the habit years ago, before the old Duke's death, when the house was large and unfamiliar, and sleep had been elusive. And she walked the staff passage alone in the hour before the household woke, not for any purpose she could have named, but because in that hour the house was hers, in a way it was not at any other time, empty of eyes. She had been walking for 20 minutes when she heard the sound from behind the scullery door, a cough, shallow and wet. She pushed the door open. Nell, the youngest kitchen maid, 14 years old, was curled on her pallet with her face turned to the wall. The cold from the stone floor was visible in the air above her. Cecily had seen the girl coughing for 3 days and had asked Mrs. Vane twice about the apothecary, and twice been told the girl had only a winter chill and was well enough. She was not well enough. Cecily set the candle on the shelf, pulled the rough blanket from the end of the pallet, and laid it over the girl. And then, because the girl turned at the warmth and her eyes were wide and frightened, Cecily did the only thing she could think to do in the dark, cold kitchen, with nothing useful in her hands. She sat on the cold floor beside the pallet and began to recite the 23rd Psalm from memory, holding the small devotional book she had taken from the shelf near the candle, her thumb on the spine, her eyes on the girl's face and not on the page, and not. She did not hear the door open. She finished the psalm. Nell's eyes had closed. Cecily rose, replaced the devotional book, lifted the candle. Lord Dunmore was standing in the doorway of the scullery, with his coat still on, and his face entirely still, and she had no idea how long he had been there. She did not say anything. She walked past him with the candle and back into the passage, and he stepped aside to let her, and she heard him fall into step behind her, and they walked the length of the passage in silence until they reached the door that led back to the family quarters. "The apothecary should be sent for," she said. "Yes," he said. Mrs. Vane has said twice it was not necessary. I will send Thomas myself this morning. She turned to look at him. His face was not soft. It was not precisely cold either. It was the face of a man who had just understood something that he had been trying to understand for some time, and who had not yet decided what to do with the understanding. "Thank you, my lord," she said. "The book," he said quietly. The text was not legible in that light. She held his gaze. She did not explain. He said nothing more. He took a step back toward the kitchen, as though he had simply been making his own early morning inspection. And she went through the door and up the stairs, and stood in her room with her back against the closed door, and the candle burning down in her hand, and her heart a terrible loud drum in the wall of her chest. He knew. Whatever she had believed about the architecture of her concealment, the walls were thinner than she had thought, and he had been standing on the other side of them for longer than she had realized. And the only question was what he would do with what he now held. 2 days passed. He said nothing. He continued to review the accounts. He sent Thomas to the apothecary. He asked Mrs. Vane twice more for the missing invoices. He found other discrepancies, deeper in the ledgers, and he noted them in his own book in a script that Cecily could not read. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he asked her to walk with him in the park. She was not certain it was a request exactly. He said, "The day is clear, Your Grace, if you have no objection to the east walk." And she had said she had no objection. And they had gone out through the east door in coats and gloves, with the grass under their feet gone silver stiff with the first frost of the season. They walked in silence for a time that she did not measure. The park was stripped back to its bones at this stage of autumn, the elms bare and angular, the lawns visible in their real shape without the decoration of summer. He walked with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the middle distance, and she walked beside him, and was aware of exactly how large he was, and how quiet, and how much space each of his silences occupied. "When I was 21, he said without looking at her, my sister Philippa made her debut." He paused. She did not succeed. The season decided she was strange. She could not read the names on the card trays. She could not read the menus at dinner. She could not read the calling cards that were left. And so she could not thank anyone. And they read her silence as coldness. He turned his head slightly. "She is not cold. She is the warmest person I have ever known." Cecily walked. "I read to her for 5 years," he said, "every evening after dinner, when we were at the same house. Letters, account books, novels she pretended not to care about and memorized." He stopped. She stopped with him. He put his hand into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a small rectangle wrapped in a piece of brown cloth. He unwrapped it. A watercolor miniature, the paint worn soft at the edges from handling. A young woman in a blue Spencer jacket, her hair a pale brown, her expression half a step from laughing. "She lives in Portugal now," he said, "with a husband who reads to her every morning before breakfast." He looked at the miniature for a moment. Then he wrapped it again and put it away. The silence between them was different now. It had a shape she could not name, one that had not existed before he spoke. "She is happy?" Cecily said finally. "She is," he said. "She is the only happy person I know." Cecily looked at the bare elms. The cold lay still against her cheek. "I cannot read," she said. The words came out the way breath comes out in cold air. Visible, there, incapable of being taken back. "I never could. I do not," she said, and stopped. Began again. "I have managed without it. I have memorized most of what I need. The letters. The documents. Mrs. Vane has been reading them to me, and I did not know, or I chose not to know what she was choosing to tell me, which is perhaps the same failure by a different name. Dunmore was quiet for a moment. No, it is not the same failure at all. She turned to look at him. His jaw was set, not with coldness, she thought, but with the specific tension of a man who is deciding something. "Sit down," he said, in a voice that brooked exactly the same amount of disagreement as a closed door. He gestured toward the stone bench at the edge of the east walk, the one with the lichen growing at the base and the view of the park's far wall. She sat. He did not. He stood with his back to the wind and looked at her. "I am going to need to understand what Mrs. Vane has told you," he said, "and what she has not. I cannot do that without your help." "You are the trust administrator," she said. "You could simply take the books." "I am not interested in the books alone," he said. "I am interested in what has been done to you." Her hands were in her lap, and she did not move them. "What she has been doing constitutes fraud," he said. "But to demonstrate it, I need to be able to show a record of what she told you versus what the documents actually say. That requires your testimony. It requires that you tell me, in sequence, every occasion on which she read a document to you, and what she said it contained. And in order to give you that testimony," Cecily said carefully, "I would be required to admit, formally, that I cannot read." "Yes," he said. The cold had come up through the stone of the bench. She looked at the frost on the grass. "She will say I managed the estate incompetently," she said. "She will say the house is in disorder because I was incapable of overseeing it." "It is not in disorder because you were incapable," he said, his voice still level, still without warmth of the sentimental kind, though it had something in it she was beginning to understand differently than warmth. "It is in disorder because she introduced disorder deliberately, so that you would need her to explain it to you. That is not your failure. That is her design. If you are watching what she does not let herself show in her face, how still she becomes, how her hands press together in her lap just once before she controls them, then you are seeing something this room has never seen. Stay a little longer." What followed was 3 days of Mrs. Vane's best work. Lady Portia Westall came to call, as she did each November, with her 2 daughters and her talent for filling silences with assessments. She sat in the drawing room with the fire too high for the room's comfort and 3 cups of tea, and said in a carrying voice to the elder daughter beside her that it was very sad about Ravenmore. Was it not? That the Duchess simply could not manage her own affairs, and that one hoped Lord Dunmore would bring some order to the place before the tenants began to complain in earnest. She said it as though Cecily were not seated 12 feet away. She said it as though a duchess were a category of furniture that could not be expected to hear. Cecily said, "Lady Westall," in a voice that was entirely pleasant, "would you care for more tea?" and handed the woman the cup she had already filled, and met her eye, and held it until Lady Westall looked away first. But the words sat in the room afterward. They always did. That evening, Mrs. Vane asked to speak with Cecily privately in the housekeeper's office. She closed the door, and she placed a letter on the table between them. "This came this morning, Your Grace," she said, "from one of the estate creditors. It is distressing. I thought it better to read it to you here, where we might decide together how it should be managed." She read it in a voice of careful sympathy. A creditor demanding immediate settlement of a debt of £300 against the estate, threatening to bring the matter before the trust administrators as evidence of mismanagement. She read it slowly, as one reads to a person who needs time to understand. "I did not authorize any debt of £300, Cecily said, "No, Your Grace. The document exists, however. And if Lord Dunmore were to see it—" Mrs. Vane paused. "There is a draft reply here. I have prepared it, in case Your Grace wished to resolve the matter quietly, without it becoming part of the accounts review." She placed a second sheet on the table. "If Your Grace would sign below, I can post it tomorrow, and the matter will be settled before he sees it." Cecily looked at the second sheet. She could see it was a document. She could see her name already written at the bottom of it. In Mrs. Vane's careful imitation of her hand. She had seen that hand before. The question was whether she could prove it. "I will consider it," she said. "Leave it with me." She could feel in the housekeeper's stillness the cost of that response. Mrs. Vane had expected either a signature or a scene, and the calm refusal of both was a new variable. She took the first letter back. She left the draft reply. After she left, Cecily sat with the document for a long time, her hands flat on the table, not touching it. What she could not read told her everything. The next morning, she had Thomas bring a message to Lord Dunmore at the inn in the village, where he had been staying to avoid the appearance of impropriety during the accounts review. The message was 5 words, which Thomas carried verbally. "I have the document. Come." Dunmore arrived within the hour. Mrs. Vane chose that morning to act. She had evidently read something in the preceding days that told her the window was closing. She sent a note to the 2 house guests who had arrived that week, the Holloways from the neighboring estate, inviting them to witness an important matter concerning the household accounts, as Lord Dunmore would wish the local community represented. She gathered Thomas, the under-butler, and the 2 footmen in the great hall, the same hall where she had first produced a letter on Cecily's behalf the morning of Dunmore's arrival. And she stood before them all with a piece of paper and a voice that did not shake. "I regret to inform you all," she said, "that I have in my hand a letter written by Her Grace the Duchess of Ravenmore to the trust administrators, acknowledging that the estate's accounts are beyond her management and requesting that the trust assume direct administration of Ravenmore House in its entirety." She held the letter up. "I have been present in this household for 11 years. I have watched a kind woman struggle with responsibilities that require skills she does not possess." She paused, and then read from the letter itself. "I acknowledge that I cannot manage my own affairs, and I surrender the trust's authority to those better equipped to exercise it." She looked up. "This is not a judgment. It is a mercy." She began to read. Cecily had arrived at the doorway of the great hall 30 seconds into it. Long enough to know what it was. The document Mrs. Vane was reading was not long, no more than a page from the pace of it. A page read aloud in a room of people who believe they are hearing the truth is a very long page, and every sentence Mrs. Vane delivered in that careful voice of sorrowful duty landed in the assembled faces of the household and the Holloways and the under-butler, with the weight of a verdict being recorded. Cecily watched the Holloway husband's expression shift from polite attention to something careful and assessing. She watched Thomas in the far corner of the hall look at the floor. She watched the housekeeper's voice not waver once. She stood in the doorway of the great hall and listened to Mrs. Vane read words in her name that she had never spoken, and she did not move, because she had been here before, in some form, many times, standing before words she could not contest with her own eyes, and the only thing she had ever had was her stillness and her dignity and the knowledge of what she had and had not done. Dunmore came through the outer door at the end of the reading, and he had a man behind him. Mr. Hargreave, 60 years old, the trust's solicitor, a man who had ridden from York that morning because the Viscount's letter had reached him 2 days prior, had with him a satchel and an expression of contained professional displeasure, and the original copies of 4 documents that had passed between Ravenmore House and his office in the preceding 8 months, none of which matched the summaries that Mrs. Vane had provided to the Duchess. He set the originals on the hall table without ceremony. Dunmore walked to the center of the room. Mrs. Vane's voice had stopped. The hall was very quiet, in the way that large old rooms go quiet, when something they have held a long time is about to be changed. "Mrs. Vane," Dunmore said. His voice was the same temperature it always was. "The document you are holding. Let Mr. Hargreave see it." A pause, then the housekeeper held it out, and the solicitor took it, and looked at it, and set it beside the originals. "The handwriting," Hargreave said. "It is not Her Grace's hand." Dunmore looked at Mrs. Vane. Not at the letter. At the woman. "Her affairs are in perfect order," he said. "Mrs. Vane is dismissed." He said it the way he said everything, level, without heat, without triumph, with the quality of a statement that has already happened before the words arrive. He said it in front of Hargreave, in front of the Holloways, in front of Thomas and the under-butler, and the 2 footmen and the household that had watched its head housekeeper operate without restraint for 18 months, and the room received it with the held-breath silence of a room that has been waiting for a sentence to complete. Mrs. Vane's face did not collapse. She was not that sort of woman. What happened was a gradual, precise subtraction, as though everything she had arranged about herself was being quietly removed, item by item, until what remained was simply a person of middle age who had gone very still. She said, "Your Grace," once to Cecily, in a voice that was not quite an apology and not quite a plea, but occupied the space where both might have lived. "You will be given a character for your 11 years of prior service," Cecily said. "No more." Thomas went with Mrs. Vane to her quarters. Hargreave produced the originals, and Dunmore read them aloud to Cecily in a low voice, while the Holloways were seen to by the remaining staff, and what they contained was not as bad as Cecily had feared, because Dunmore had written to Hargreave in August and September, and again in October. And Hargreave had kept copies of everything, including the 3 letters that had never been delivered to Cecily, which Mrs. Vane had intercepted and misdirected, and which now sat on the hall table as evidence both of the fraud and of the fact that the fraud had been carefully anticipated. The debt of £300 did not exist. The payments to the fictitious supplier amounted to £94, still recoverable. The rest, Hargreave said, adjusting his spectacles, was recoverable in full. Cecily stood in the hall after they had gone and looked at the portraits on the wall. The old Duke's portrait hung between the windows, his face kind and slightly unreadable in the way of painted faces, his hands folded in his lap over what had always been a household account ledger, though the detail was too fine to confirm from this distance. She had always assumed it was a ledger. She would have to ask someone. That thought made something inside her chest loosen for the first time in 18 months, the way a knot loosens when the tension that was holding it finally releases, the recognition that she would have to ask someone. She could ask someone. She was not alone in this room with what she could not read. He had not gone far. He was in the passage. She found him there, his coat still on, his hands at his sides, and she said, "You wrote to Hargreave in August." "Yes, before you came here." "I had the August accounts already. The figures were not consistent." She looked at him. His face had that same quality of attention she had noticed on the steps the first morning, that cataloging precision that she had read. Then, as coldness. She read it differently now. She read it the way she read voices, the way she had learned to read things that were not words, with the particular accuracy of a person whose other faculties had been forced to carry the weight that one was missing. He had noticed that her right hand was pressed flat against her seam the first morning. He had not said anything. He had written to Hargreave. He had sent Thomas to the apothecary. He had told her about Philippa. He had stood in the doorway of the scullery at 5 in the morning and heard her recite a psalm by heart to a sick girl, and he had understood, and he had said nothing that would require her to say it first. He had been waiting for her to choose. She was aware of the cold of the passage and the width of his shoulders and the specific way he stood when he was not sure what came next, which was with his hands at his sides rather than behind his back, which was how he stood when he was certain. She was aware that her own heart was audible in her ears, and that she had not spoken his given name aloud yet. Not once. And that the passage was very narrow, and the candles on the bracket behind him were low, and the warmth between them in the cold air was theirs and not the house's. "My lord," she said. "Cecily," he said. She was very still, and then she was not, and neither was he. And what passed between them was not a declaration and not a vow, and not anything the season would have had a word for. It was a hand at her wrist, her glove already gone, his thumb at the inside of her wrist where her pulse was very loud, and his face close, and the cold of the passage warmed by the single fact of two people standing in it, who had decided, without ceremony, that the distance between them was no longer necessary. He kissed her with the quietness of a man who has waited a long time to mean it, and she let herself be kissed by him, with the quietness of a woman who has kept herself very safe for a very long time and has chosen, for the first time, to be something other than safe. The fire in the library was the good fire, the one in the deep hearth with the iron grate that held the heat, and the room smelled of wood smoke, and the particular dry, cold smell of books in winter. And outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning, tentative and small, catching the last light before dark. Dunmore sat in the chair to the left of the fire, and Cecily sat across from him on the low settle, close enough that their knees were 8 inches apart, and between them on the side table was the household account ledger, open to the November pages, and the trust record with her name printed at the top as the named beneficiary, and a clean sheet of paper and a fresh pen, because she was going to dictate a letter to Mr. Hargreave, and she was going to sign it herself with her own name, the name she had been learning, one letter at a time, in the months since everything had changed. He read to her. He had a good voice for it, level and warm in a way his speaking voice was not always, because reading aloud required a different kind of surrender than talking did, and he had been doing it since he was 21, and it had left its mark on him in the way that any long practice of tenderness leaves its mark. He read the account figures, and the trust provisions, and the November expenditures, and she listened with the focused precision of a woman who had spent 27 years learning how to listen as other people read. When he came to the line with her name, the formal designation, Cecily, Duchess of Ravenmore, named beneficiary and sole present holder of the Ravenmore Trust, he read it and stopped. She said, "Again?" He read it again. She picked up the pen. On the mantelpiece, between a small porcelain clock and a branch of dried autumn leaves that Jenny had put there for decoration, the watercolor miniature of Philippa rested against the wall, unwrapped, the paint worn soft at the edges, a young woman in a blue Spencer jacket, with an expression half a step from laughing. Cecily did not look at it. She had asked to see it 2 evenings prior, and he had handed it to her, and she had held it in both hands for a moment and said, "She has your mouth, the way it is when it almost moves." He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "She would like you." "I would like her," Cecily had said, and then asked, "May I write to her?" And the thing that crossed his face at that question, the particular yielding of something that had been held tightly for a long time, was a thing she had not quite seen on him before, and would not forget. She had told him, in the weeks since the hall, what it had been, not the shame of it exactly, but the architecture of the concealment, how she had built a life from the outside in, from what others could see rather than what she could do, until the life was very beautiful and very finished looking, and she was standing inside it, like a woman in a room she was not permitted to open the windows of. He had listened the way he did everything, with that quality of complete attention. And he had said, when she finished, that there was a woman in the village who taught the farmers' children to read, and who was said to be good at it, and who would come to the house on whatever terms Cecily preferred. She had said thank you. He had said she was welcome. And then he had said, "You have managed one of the largest estates in the north of England for 18 months, without the use of written language, under deliberate interference, and you kept the household running, the staff paid, the tenants intact, and the trust's core assets undepleted. I have reviewed 3 years of accounts. Your husband's administration is the only comparable period." He paused. "You are not deficient in any capacity that matters." She had not said anything. She had looked at the fire. "There are things," he said after a moment, "that I cannot read. I cannot read the kind of room that smells like trouble before it shows. I cannot read the face of a person who is keeping something. I cannot read what a man means when he says yes, and does so while looking at his hands." He turned to look at her. "You read all of that. You have been reading it this entire time. That is not a small thing." Outside the library window, the snow fell on the park in silence, covering the frost, covering the bare elms, covering the east walk and the stone bench and the path from the house to the village, laying a clean new surface over everything that the autumn had stripped back to bones. Inside, the fire was bright and level, and the ledger was open, and the pen was in her hand, and the letter she would write tonight would reach Hargreave by Friday, and would close the last outstanding matter of Mrs. Vane's removal with a finality that nothing after could reverse. Dunmore turned the page. Cecily wrote her name. If Cecily's story has stayed with you, the silence she kept, the weight she carried, the unexpected mercy of being seen by someone who knew exactly what to look for, stay a moment before you go. Leave a word in the comments if you are glad she was not required to explain herself. The snow kept falling, the fire kept burning. On the mantelpiece, the miniature kept its place. A young woman in a blue Spencer jacket, unwrapped after 3 years of folded dark, watching a room that had finally learned to let the light in.